Hello and welcome to the JP Morgan Distinguished Lecture Series on AI. I would now like to introduce your host for the meeting, Manuela Veloso. You may begin.
Yes, hi everyone. Thanks for coming to one more of our distinguished lecture series. This is one of a very special one, and I'm very pleased to introduce Charles Isbell. Dr. Charles Isbell actually he did his undergrad studies in information and computer science from Georgia Tech, and then he did his master's and his PhD at MIT's famous AI lab. And then when he finished, he actually worked at AT&T Bell Labs, which in those days, during the late 90s and 2000s, was really a place where a lot of AI researchers would join to do very compelling AI and in thinking about industry in the AI Bell Labs, AT&T Bell Labs. And in fact, one of my PhD students, Peter Stone, worked with Charles Isbell those days in 2000 until 2002 at AT&T Bell Labs. And then after that, so Dr. Isbell returned to Georgia Tech as first a professor, and now he is the John Imlay Jr. Dean of the College of Computing. So the fact that it's called the John Imlay Jr. means it's an additional honor to being the Dean of the College of Computing. And then, Dr. Isbell's interests are varied, but there are two main things I would like to share, which is in fact the fact that he always cared about AI in this aspect of interacting with humans. So it was always about this concept of like, how do humans and AI interact from all the aspects that Dr. Isbell has studied. And then another aspect of his contributions have to do with education. In fact, Dr. Isbell was one of the first to introduce, if not the first, to introduce a MOOC-based kind of master's in computer science at Georgia Tech, which brought a lot of attention, actually internationally and nationally, and even like presentations at the Congress level, all sorts of like visibility for the education and for the AI directly interacting with humans. So one additional fact is that Dr. Isbell, he's a fellow of the major kind of like associations in the field of AI, Triple AI, and also ACM. And in the citation for ACM is actually very kind of like appropriate for his life of research in AI and in society. So it says that, reads that Dr. Isbell is a fellow of the ACM, and it says for contributions to interactive machine learning, so interactive, this type of interactions with the humans, and for contributions to increase access and diversity in computing. So finally, before I pass the word to Dr. Charles Isbell, for all of you attending this event, I would recommend that as a homework, the first homework of this lecture is to Google YouTube thriller Isbell. And you can actually see a very beautiful video in which Dr. Isbell sings the thriller of like Michael Jackson, but about machine learning. So don't forget to enjoy that. It's a wonderful video. So again, thriller, Isbell, YouTube, and you'll get it. Okay, thank you very much, Charles, to being with us. And it's a real honor and a pleasure to hear you talk on humans and AI, the problems and the promise. Thanks a lot, Charles.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I'm very happy to be here. I know how strange it is to do these sorts of things where we're talking. I can't see you. You can sort of see me. We're not in the same room, but I hope that this will still manage to be an interactive talk. I'm going to try to leave plenty of time for questions at the end, and we can take it anywhere that you want to take it. We'll sort of see how it goes. So let's start with what I'm going to talk about. So as Manuela pointed out, this is the title of the talk is Humans and AI, the Problems and the Promise. The title actually has multiple interpretations. That's somewhat on purpose. When I put this talk together, I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to focus on. And sort of how I sort of push it one way or the other depends a lot upon what my mood is. And I think the key thing there is the word problem, right? So there are problems in the sense of bad, negative things that can happen, but there's also problems in the sense of what are the interesting things that we have to think about when we want to grapple with the notion of AI and human beings working together. What exactly does that mean? What are the cool things we can think about it? Does it apply to a wide range of situations, perhaps where we have not been thinking about it before? So I, of course, think the answer to that is yes. And I'm going to try to touch on both kinds of problems, the sort of interesting technical problems, even philosophical problems that arise when you think about humans and AI working together, but also the real problems that come with the consequences of doing this without a lot of reflection and thought. So we'll sort of try to cover the gamut here. And again, anything that you want to ask me about, I'm more than happy to talk about. So I think the first thing we should do is we should set some terms. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes to define a few terms here and tell you what I mean. And so let's start with the very simple one, which is what is artificial intelligence? There are lots of definitions. I think my favorite one is the first one here, which is that it's the art of making computers act like they do in the movies. I think that really does capture this kind of almost ineffable quality we think we have as human beings, that we want to see computers be kind of magical in the same way that we are. The downside of that, by the way, is in the second definition, which is problems we can't solve yet using a computer, but that people sort of manage to do. One of the things that sort of the downside of AI, and I think it's sort of built into the conversation and has been since the beginning, is that once we solve a problem, we decide it's no longer intelligence, which means that the notion of AI is an ever-moving target. It's nothing that we can ever quite accomplish on the one end. And on the other end, we sort of believe that as human beings, we're special and magical. And so we can't build a machine that's as good as we are. And so it's basically a problem you can't solve and a game you can't win. But even with those constraints, I think we pull out a lot of interesting technology, and we have a lot of impact. And we'll talk a little bit about that this morning. So the definition I want to settle on, though, is that we're about building machines that do things that if humans did them, we'd call them intelligent. And I like that definition for a lot of reasons. One is that it actually expands the notion beyond what we typically teach or what we typically talk about around AI and machine learning. And I think this picture gives you a little bit of a piece of that. So this is a framework that's been championed by Andrew Moore, who is late of CMU, and he would talk a lot about what he called the AI stack, where we think about what it means to be intelligent, we perceive, we learn, we decide, and we act. And most of what we do in machine learning in particular lives in the learn space, at least as researchers live in the learn space. We're doing inference, we're doing statistical modeling, we're building deep neural networks or whatever it is that we're doing. And then somehow that feeds into some kind of decision support process. But the real power of AI, I think, is near the top. It's in acting, not just deciding, not just learning, not just building models, but in acting on the world. And there's a nice little duality in the way that we think about acting. We think about acting in the sense of autonomy, which will come up again in a few minutes. But we also think of acting in concert with others, and particularly in concert with human beings. And this is the part that I want to focus on. I want to focus on, for the rest of this talk, what happens when we have AI and we have human beings working together, what that interaction means, for a couple of reasons. One, because I just think it's interesting, but also because when we say that our goal is to build systems where if human beings did them, we would call them intelligent. Well, one of the major things that we do as human beings that's intelligent is that we interact with other human beings. And that if we don't think about that as a crucial and central part of the systems that we build, then we're actually leaving out the most interesting part of what AI can be. And so this is sort of the motivation for the kind of research that I do, and is going to be the central assumption of what's interesting in this talk. So what does that mean? So as Manuela pointed out, I I spend my time thinking about interactive machine learning and interactive AI. Here I'm saying interactive AI instead of interactive machine learning, because the truth is, even though I look like a machine learning researcher in a kind of narrow sense, fundamentally the reason I'm interested in machine learning is because I think it is a crucial part of artificial intelligence, and I'm interested in building these systems and understanding how to build these systems, these agents, these things that are autonomous, but also have to live and interact with large numbers, dozens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of other intelligent agents, some of whom may be human. Now, in order for that to work, it means that we have to build agents that have a lot of properties, and we don't always write these things out, but I think it's worthwhile doing so. Again, just to kind of set the stage and sort of explain to you what it is I mean by certain things and why I do certain things that I do. We want agents that are transparent. We want them to be persistent. And if they're persistent, they're clearly going to have to learn. That's why they have to be adaptive. Because they have to live in communities, they need to be collaborative. And because those communities involve human beings, they're going to need to be believable. Because there's many human beings, they're going to have to be scalable. And ultimately, to be useful, they're going to have to be buildable. If we can make progress on AI systems that are like this, then that means we can build systems that work with humans to accomplish tasks much more effectively. I'll try to argue for a little bit for why that is in a moment. Can be more robust to changes in the environment, and can better coexist with humans as long-lived partners rather than rise up and kill us all. So I think it helps to ground that notion in some examples, and I have a lot that we could talk about. I've been thinking about this for a very long time, as I know have many of you. I know Tucker Balch is out there. He's been thinking about this, building robots forever. Manuela and her students and colleagues have been working on these kinds of problems for decades. And I'm looking at sort of the range of work that is out there. I'm going to pick on a particular one, not the most recent work that I've been doing, but something that goes back a few years, because I think it nicely gives an idea of what it actually means to build intelligent systems as opposed to solve a very specific machine learning problem. And the problem I want to focus on for just a few minutes is interactive narrative. So what is interactive narrative? Well, there's a kind of technical definition. It's about building software systems that simulate environments where there are players or other agents, human beings, who are using some kind of command to control some avatar, some character that's out there, and those actions controlling the avatar influence the environment and ultimately influence the narrative. Now, here by narrative, I mean something relatively simple, which is kind of a trajectory of events over time, a story, a game. You do these things all the time. And there are lots of examples. All of you have played video games. All of you have at least heard of, if not interacted in choose your own ending adventure games, choose your own adventure books. We used to have those. Anyone here is older than 50 has probably read one. And if you're younger than 30, you probably haven't, but these things used to exist, and they're kind of digital versions of them now. But one of the reasons to push on this is because the notion of a narrative is kind of fundamental to humans. We tell stories. We build stories in our heads to remember things and to think about things. We share stories. That's a lot of how information gets done. But also because this notion of a narrative, the notion of a story, really is a fundamental data structure. It represents everything. Games like chess, World of Warcraft, those are all stories. Training, education simulations, those are really stories. There's a sequence of things that you have to do. There's some objective you're trying to achieve. But even simple things like robot swarms are stories, right? Even I want to take a bunch of robots and I want to stack boxes in a factory somewhere or whatever. Well, there's a story. These things have to happen in sequence. Things have to work together. There are bad versions of those stories. If you don't end up with stacked boxes, then you end up in a bad story. There are good versions where you do that. There are better versions where that stacking happens quickly or it happens with some style or something. And then there are less good versions, even if you end up in an outcome. And so in all of these cases, it's not just the end goal that matters, it's the way in which you get there that matters. And so narrative is a kind of interesting way to think about a whole set of AI problems. Now, the first thing you might ask, if we're going to dive into that, is that actually a hard problem? And the answer is yes, it's extremely hard. And it's hard for two completely different sorts of reasons. One is a very technical one, but one is kind of fundamental about what the nature of narrative is. So it's difficult to author games, to create stories, to create narratives that allow for coherence, that is, give you good stories or good narratives or good trajectories, but also allow for some autonomy. Let me give you a really simple example. So all of you are familiar with murder mysteries. Murder mysteries are an interesting narrative trope because they have a very particular structure, right? So it's a murder mystery. So the first thing that has to happen is there has to be a murder. The second thing that has to happen is there has to be a mystery. You don't actually know who it is. The way these stories go is something happens, you're sort of involved. Every single person, it turns out, has a motive for killing whoever got killed. And there will be at least one red herring. You're sure it's, I don't know, the doctor, but it turns out that it's going to be the butler, and you'll do this because there'll be a whole bunch of really fast reveals. And in the end, you'll know who did it. Well, tiny little changes. If you were trying to build, imagine trying to build a game or build some kind of interaction where you were going to be able to explore a murder mystery. There's so many things that can go wrong. What happens if the murder happens and you see it? The player sees it. Well, then it's no longer a murder mystery. It's a slasher flick, right? And there's not much change between those two things other than a bunch of people getting killed as opposed to one person getting killed. What if the person who is supposed to be the murderer or the person who's supposed to be murdered ends up being with the person in the first place? So you're going to have to change on the fly who's actually the murderer, who's actually being murdered. You're going to have to push the person along in the story, and so you're going to have to intervene in a variety of ways to make certain that you end up with a good outcome at the end. And what's going on there is a fundamental tension between the autonomy of the person who's involved in this, what they want to do, and the needs of the author, the authorial intent. And so building that out to give autonomy and agency to the other agents on the one hand, but also to build a coherent experience on the other is just fundamentally difficult. And there's so many ways that it can go wrong. But it's also hard from a purely technical point of view. There's not just an exponential number of stories, there's a hyper exponential number of stories. So even something simple like chess, someone once told me, and so I believe them, that if every atom in the universe were a printer printing out all possible chess games or all possible Go games, 1,000 per second, you still couldn't print out all the possibilities before the heat death of the universe. So there's a lot of trajectories, and it's not just growing like this, it's growing like this and growing like this and growing like this, and the distance matters. And so just doing that search is fundamentally an impossible problem on its face. So this idea of narrative and not thinking of, oh, let me take this picture and see if it's a cat or not, but instead, I'm going to make decisions and interact in the world over time to come to some sort of outcome in the face of uncertainty and in the face of other agents also interacting in the world is fundamentally a difficult problem. But it turns out that we can solve it anyway, which is good, or at least we can come close to it. And in the specific case of interactive narratives, we can create what's called a drama manager or an experience manager that learns how humans react over time and then uses actions to intervene in the environment to generate a particular sequence that's preferred over another. And that can be a story or an experience. That can be stacking the boxes on a factory floor. And in fact, we can use all the same tools that we've been using in machine learning for decades to optimize for good outcomes. So here's a particular tool that I like to use, and I think most of you are familiar with it, but I'll go over quickly, and that's reinforcement learning. So reinforcement learning differs from supervised learning in that rather than having a set of inputs and outputs and then you map a function, you're instead trying to build something that makes sequential decisions over time. And the way that we normally model that is we say there's an environment in the world, there's this agent, the actual thing that's trying to learn. It can take actions. And when it takes actions, it impacts that environment. It gets some kind of signal back from the environment about what it's done in sort of two forms. One is it sees the changes in the environment, that is the state, and it gets a reward. So some notion from the environment of whether what it's just done is good or bad or indifferent. There's lots of ways that can take, and of course it's a rich field. But by analogy, just think of you're walking in the world, you run into a wall, it hurts. The state of the world has changed because you ran into a wall. You got a signal from the environment, which was pain. And so probably you will avoid doing that as opposed to eating bacon or something, which tastes delicious. And so you get a sort of positive reward back. And we can formalize this, right? So it's a sequential decision-making process. We tend to think of it as a Markov decision process. There's states, there's actions, There's what's called a transition function, which tells you the physics of the world, how things change as you act on it. There's a reward. And your goal is to find a policy. What's a policy? Well, policy is something that tells you what to do when you're in a given state. What action might you take? And you want to find the policy that maximizes your long-term expected reward. And this is its own interesting set of difficult problems, but what's really nice about it is it nicely models narratives, it nicely models trajectories, it nicely models sequences of decisions that you have to make over a long period of time, and allows you to make fundamental trade-offs between something that hurts now, but will be good later, like going to college. If all you wanted to do, going to college makes no sense if you only think in terms of the next day, but it makes a lot of sense if you think in terms of the next year, the next decade, and the span of your life. So reinforcement learning is kind of a fundamental way of dealing with these sequential decisions, and therefore a very natural way to think about things like interactive narratives. The problem is, and this is often the problem, which we shall see again later, that these techniques are all about optimizing. They're all about figuring out the best answer, the correct prediction. And it turns out that if you're going to build a system that's going to try to set up the world, it will over-optimize. It will, in fact, cause the best stories. Now, I know all of you are not into video games, but those of you who are have probably heard of the expression being on rails. So if you're interacting in an environment and the system does not want you to do something like go off a cliff or go through a door or whatever, it simply doesn't let you. And that takes you out of the experience and makes you realize that you're not allowed to do certain things. So all notion of self-agency is reduced, and you end up taking a problem that you thought was well-designed or well-defined or well-described as an optimization problem, and you've actually not solved the problem you intended to solve. Instead, you've decided because you're going to have this good experience, as far as the author is concerned, you have this good experience and nothing else. And that's not really what you want. It turns out the problem really is bigger than just having a good experience. It's also having a feeling of agency and control. So what that suggests is that we need to optimize less well. We have to back off from forcing an outcome and allow for this notion of agency in order to get to a good outcome. And it turns out you can solve this problem pretty well, and it involves two technical tricks. So here's the first one. The first one is truly technical in the sense of let's just change some equations. And here you want to expand the notion of what reinforcement learning is. So rather than thinking about states and actions and a policy, we start thinking about trajectories. We start thinking about the long path we want to take over time. We, of course, still have actions. We still have a model of how the world works, the sort of physics of the world, but now it thinks about trajectories rather than just states. And we think instead of a reward, a sort of target distribution over next states. Why a target distribution over next states? Because that tells you something about where are places you would prefer to be. This is a better place to be than this, and therefore I want it to be more probable. When you define it like this, which seems like a harder problem, right? Because now I'm dealing with probability distributions, I'm thinking about real numbers, and I just don't have an answer. I have a distribution over answers. It turns out the problem actually ends up being easier. And there the goal, rather than finding a policy that maximizes long-term expected reward, your goal is to find a probabilistic policy that maps partial trajectories into distributions over actions, which allows you to manage the constraint of perfection by allowing some agency by the player or by the human being you're interacting with. And it turns out that laying off trying to find perfection actually gives you more robustness and even more replayability. So if you think about this as a game, I can play the game many times and end up having different experiences each time. And if you think about it as trying to solve a specific problem, as the human being makes decisions that are different from the ones they perhaps made in the past, you are going to be robust to that because you are not so brittle. So even though you back off into what looks like a harder problem on its face, it turns out that it's not a harder problem on its face. It actually gives you more degrees of freedom and therefore makes the problem easier. Now, there are some subtleties to this, even though I say that it's easier in some ways. One is that finding probabilistic policies are often easy. I won't go through the math here, but you can kind of imagine that if you're in a particular state here and there's some states you want to go to and you know all the actions you can take And if you take those action, the probability over the next states that you will see, you can kind of think of it as just a kind of linear algebra problem where I just want to match the probabilities of all the actions to how I want the probabilities of how I want to end up at the next state, and invert a matrix or something, and you'll end up in the right answer. And it actually turns out that is the right thing to do most of the time, and it sort of works. But sometimes finding these probabilistic policies is quite hard. So imagine a case where I'm in this state and I've got, let's say, these 3 states that I could be in next, and I don't want to ever end up in this state here, ever. But every action I take has some non-zero probability of putting me in this state. That means it's not possible to come up with a policy, a probabilistic policy that will prevent me from coming in this state, and because it can always happen. And so I don't quite know what to do in that situation. In fact, if you do the kind of naive thing, which is this kind of inversion of a matrix, it's just solving a bunch of algebra equations, you end up with things that look like negative probabilities. They're interpretable. What it means is you should do this, and every once in a while you'll end up here where you didn't want to be, and when you end up there, you should just turn back time and do it again, which would be nice, but it's actually not something we typically allow ourselves to do. And so you can only approximate. And if you can only approximate, you have to come up with something clever to determine what it means to have the best approximation. So here's some gratuitous math. And I could spend an hour explaining this, but instead what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, oh, you just minimize KL divergence, and I'm going to wave my hand like this to suggest that you should already know what KL divergence is as a fully functioning human being. And if you don't, it doesn't matter. What you really care about here is that there is a very simple and well understood way of finding the closest possible probability distribution to one that you want. It has a lot of really neat properties to it. And in fact, the neatest property to it is that you don't have to know the entire world. So remember, I said this tree is hyper exponential. It turns out you only have to look at where you are. It doesn't matter where you could have gone because you didn't go there. The only thing that matters is where you are and where you want to go next. And if you have the right kind of information, you can just make a very simple decision about what to do next. And then you'll end up where you end up. And it doesn't matter where you could have ended up, which means that even though you're going through this huge hyper exponential tree, you're just walking one path. The alternate paths don't matter. And so it actually becomes a linear problem and not a hyper exponential problem. And it is provably optimal. So even though the problem seems very hard, by backing off trying to find the optimal, but instead trying to match intentions as best you can, and if you don't get there, just don't worry about the past, worry about where you are in the future, it turns out you can solve this problem in exceptionally fast time. So there's a technical solution, and this is good. And people who do technical things like to hear this. But it turns out to really make this work, there's 2 parts. There's this equation here. There's this math, which I'm not explaining to you, but that's how you know I'm smart. I'm not actually going to explain equations to you. There's this technical thing, but there's this other thing, which is the human beings still exist. The human beings are still going to make decisions, and you can't just write an equation to make them do something. So you have to actually deal with the human beings as human beings and figure out how you can get them to do what you want. Really, the trick here is you need to get the human beings to adopt the same goals that you have. If you can get them to adopt the same goals that you have, then now it's a partnership. You're not tricking them into doing something or trying to force them down a particular path. They want to find that path, and you're just helping them when they accidentally go astray. So if we stop thinking of actions as things like, oh, I'm going to close a door, or I'm going to decide who gets killed in my murder mystery, or I'm going to not let you drive off a cliff, and so I'm not going to let the car turn this way versus that way, but instead try to convince you to do what I want you to do, then we sort of win. And those kind of options, those kind of actions are necessarily going to be the kinds of actions that fall from the way we interact with humans normally. So all of you are familiar with this. There's these things called click word responses. You may not have heard that particular term, but you recognize these things. These are ways in which human beings interact with one another. Here's 6. Reciprocation just means if you're nice to someone, that person tends to be nice to you. A consistency is about how people announce out loud the things that they intend to do, and they tend to want to be consistent about it. This is actually a very important thing. If you live in a suburb like I do, and you have someone who doesn't mow the lawn regularly, it turns out you can get them to mow the lawn by just talking to them during the winter when no one's mowing their lawn, and say, man, isn't it look beautiful whenever all the lawns look the same? They go, yeah, it does look beautiful. The next summer, they'll mow their lawn more often, and they'll think it's their idea. Social proof is the idea that you look for people who are like you, and you try to do what they do if you don't already know what to do. Liking just means you do nice things for people you like. Authority means you listen to authority, which is a very, very human trait. And scarcity is where you find things more valuable if it turns out that you think they're going away. So Black Friday is like this. Every sale is like this. I didn't actually want to buy this thing, but it's 20% off, so I have to buy it, which makes no sense, but it's a thing that we do and it works very, very well. So there are questions like, can we take these ideas of why we know how human beings work and then get them to adopt our own goals by using them? And the answer is yes, it actually works. It works very well. You can build stories. You can have people out there interacting in these environments, and you can use tricks like scarcity, reciprocity, and get people to adopt your own goals and to do better. And there are two parts of this that are important, and I think it's worthwhile taking a moment to really reflect on what they are. One is you actually get the outcome you want. If you take two groups, one you try to influence this way, and one you do not. The one you don't try to influence acts whatever way that it acts. The one you try to influence is much more likely to do what you want and come to the outcome that you were seeking than the one you weren't influencing. That's not that surprising. But here's something you might find surprising, which is it turns out that the people you actually influence feel more in control than the people you did not try to influence. So the people you don't influence, when you ask them, hey, did you feel like you were being driven along or something? They're much more likely to say yes. The people you were actually influencing, were actually driving in a particular direction, they're much more likely to say, no, I was in total control. These were all my decisions. And it's because they adopted what you wanted, and therefore they felt agency. So manipulating people into doing things and make them more likely not just to do it, but more likely to feel good about the fact that they're doing it. So this is good, right? We've done all these things that we're talking about, or at least some of them. We're moving in that direction. We have a mechanism, even in a kind of broad sense of thinking about how over time you're going to be able to interact with human beings. But somehow we went from modeling humans to entertaining humans to manipulating humans, all in the space of something like 15 minutes. And it's not entirely clear how we ended up there, other than we were trying to solve a specific problem. And I think there's a really important question to ask here: is this a mistake, assuming you think it's a mistake, that we keep making, that we keep going from trying to build a system that will allow us to understand human beings, to engage in human beings, to then manipulating them to the outcomes that we want? And how should we feel about that? Is that good or is that bad? So to answer the question of how this happens, I think it helps to like revisit what it means to have interactive machine learning versus machine learning, and the ways in which human beings work with the AI or work with the machine learning. So instead of having data, an algorithm, and a model, we have data, an algorithm, a model, and a human being that's somehow not just in this loop, but is fundamentally a part of the loop. Well, what's the human's role here, really? If we're modeling the human to solve another problem, what is it? Are we modeling the human? Is there something else going on? Well, the humans do a lot in this kind of interactive model. They provide labels. They influence the data we actually see. They move through this space, and so we see some parts of the space and not other parts of the space. They can do things like identify what the important features are. They can help you to interpret the learned model if you engage them in partners. So modeling and predicting human behavior actually involves the humans influencing what the AI and what the machine learning algorithms do. So then how do they really help if we want to think about this as making the machine learning algorithm bigger? Well, the way they really help in the end, at least in these long-term sequential things, is they allow us to search this impossibly big search space, right? That big tree. Because learning, as we know, requires lots and lots and lots of data, or it just requires the right amount of the small data. If humans can give us the right data, if they can drive us through this tree, this one path, then we can actually learn without having to learn everything, and we learn much faster. We get quite literally exponential speed up. And in fact, it turns out that this is very powerful, and it's even more powerful than you think. When we started getting into this work, all of us, I think, in the field, decades ago, we were really focused on how can we get to the optimal machine learning algorithm or the optimal AI algorithm much faster, solve this exponential problem. But it actually turns out that it's even better than that. If a human has a particular error and an AI has a particular error, it turns out when you combine the AI and the human, you actually end up with lower error than either. It's not just that you're getting the AI, the machine learning algorithm, to get there faster. It's actually better than you could ever be, but it's also better than it could be without you. So an example of this that I really like is the chess playing example. So we've known for a very long time that machines can be the best machines, can be the best humans at chess. Well, it turns out that there's a whole field out there. I don't even call it a field. It's more like a culture and a group of people who do these things where they pit computers against computers and things like chess, Go, a whole series of games. And then there's a set of people who do it where humans and machines work together. And it turns out when a human and a machine work together, they're much better than either a human or a machine. But importantly, even if the human being is not an expert, the human being can make the machine better than it would be without the human, and certainly better than the human being could be. And that's because the abilities of the machine and the abilities of the human are somewhat different from one another. People are very good at generalizing across lots of different examples and doing transfer. They're very good at saying, well, this part of the space looks better than this part of the space, or I think this is the kind of thing you care about, even if they aren't good chess players in this case. And that's enough to steer the machine into a good place. And if humans provide the right data, if they tell you about policy, for example, if they tell you what you should be doing, if they tell you what part of the space you should be in, you get massively better results than you would otherwise, and you get those results very quickly. So this is very important. By the way, Manuela, this slide is for you. This slide and this slide basically show that all the work that we've done in this space is slightly better than all the work that Peter's done in this space. So I just wanted to share that with you. So it works very, very, very well. And you can show huge, the details of this don't really matter. The version that really matters here for you is that you can learn faster and you can learn better if you have humans working with the machines to solve very simple problems or very complex problems. I mostly live in the world of video games because it's very easy to get random people off the street who have never played Pac-Man to figure out how Pac-Man is supposed to work without being experts. And so you can do these kind of tests and isolate where the strength and the power is coming from. So it works, and it works quite well. Sometimes. Sometimes it's very, very bad. And this is where we get to the problems of not cool problems we can solve, but problems that are created by having machine learning, AI, and humans working together. So here's a very simple example. It's not much different from what you've done before. This is a little game you can play where you're trying to teach the dog to get to the door and not trample over your beautiful and highly diverse garden. And you do the kinds of things you would expect to do. Whenever the dog gets closer to the door, you give it a reward. Whenever the dog goes on your garden, you give it a bad reward, bad dog. And eventually, the goal is it'll learn how to walk to the door. What actually happens in these cases is that it learns to go into the garden. And the reason it learns to go into the garden is that if it goes in the garden and then leaves the garden, it gets a reward. So you end up with these sort of positive cycles, this sort of positive feedback loop, where the thing that makes sense to the person to convey to the machine actually teaches the machine the wrong lesson. You end up with a completely different outcome from the one that you wanted, even though it feels like it makes sense. There are ways of dealing with this, but it's actually quite a bit of work to think carefully about how to avoid these positive cycles in order to get the outcome that you actually want. So it requires a lot of reflection. Anyone who's raised kids has come into some situation. Certainly, anyone who has teenagers has come across this at one point or another. The point is that is actually a hard problem, and we see this pattern over and over and over again. We've been able to use human beings who aren't particularly experts, but by creating games, we can crowdsource and show that we can do a much better job of things like protein folding. We can do a much better job for optical character recognition. We can do a much better job with image labeling. It works and it works and it works, but it also goes wrong. It turns out we get people to label things, we give them data, and we end up in situations like this, where, and you've heard of all of these things, you get face recognition where if you're a young female of Asian descent, it turns out the camera always thinks you're blinking, right? And so it doesn't recognize you the way you want it to be recognized. I myself, in the early days of, you put your hand under a sink and then it detects you and then you can wash your hands. Turns out it doesn't work very well with darker skin. The darker skin you have, the harder it is to get the thing to turn on. These things are fixable, but these are things that were deployed out in the world that have actual consequences. Every single woman listening to me now knows that Siri is not as good at recognizing what they ask it to do as it is for their male counterparts. We have a great deal of issues that sort of arise from here of when we try to build systems that interact with humans. And there are good technical reasons for why this is. Let me give you another example of how it can go wrong in these kind of simple cases. There was a big kerfuffle, some of you would know about it, I guess last summer now, with Pulse, which is this wonderfully built system that could do very clever things where it would take downsampled images and then hallucinate high resolution images. And it worked very well, and the paper got was accepted and got quite a bit of acclaim. The system got out there in the world, and people started using it, and someone discovered that if you take someone like, you all recognize who this is in the top, it would take someone like Barack Obama, downsample, and then generate something new. You ended up with someone who does not appear to be ethnically consistent with Obama's own ethnicity. The bottom here is a picture of me. There's tons of these that are out there. Basically, Pulse turned effectively all people of color into white people. In my case, it hallucinated blonde hair and put about 20 or 30 pounds on me. The second thing being much worse than the first. But you see these sorts of things happening again and again, and they have massive consequences in the real world, not just in pictures that you might see. We know that they alter lives. We know that something like 38 states at this point use black box machine learning techniques in order to determine whether someone is likely to commit a crime again. And this has real impact on whether someone gets parole or the length of their sentences. Of course, it turns out you're not actually asking people to predict whether someone commits a crime. What you're actually doing is asking to predict whether they're going to be arrested and convicted of a crime, which is not at all the same thing. But we don't see this. Amazon had a big kerfuffle about a year ago where they had to take one of their systems away because it seemed to prefer males to females. But actually, what it was really doing was capturing that Amazon preferred males to females, which was very embarrassing for everybody. But we see these things having kind of real impact. And it's not obvious of what the impacts are when you first start. So we have to make it better. We have to do a better job of it. There are ways to do that. But I think the biggest one that people tend to miss, and what happens is a natural reaction, and I'm completely sure that several of you are having this reaction, is all of those are problems of bad data, right? But to be clear, making things better, providing clarity, is not about bad data. It can be, but it's not. It is true that garbage in, garbage out is a thing that matters in the world. It is true that computers have a very irritating habit of doing what we ask them to do rather than what we want them to do. And so if you give them bad data, they will do bad things. They will basically capture all of your biases. They will solve the problem of predicting arrests and convictions, not the problem of predicting crime. And so yes, bad data leads to bad results. But good data doesn't necessarily lead to good results. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is that in order to get the data that you want, you probably need perfect data. And perfect data, which perfectly describes what you want, even though you're not entirely sure what you want, is probably impossible to get. But even when you have perfect data, it turns out it fails. So if you think about the Pulse problem, the obvious answer to that is, well, you should just have a better, more representative distribution over people. Turns out it doesn't work. There have been people who've run some experiments on, well, we're just going to train on Africans from Senegal. Turns out Pulse breaks under those circumstances, at least as it comes out of the box. Why? Well, there's apparently a bunch of other assumptions built into the algorithm, built into the hyperparameters, built into the system, where it just defaults to this kind of behavior. It's not just the data, there's something else that's going on. And that bias is unavoidable. And that's okay, because bias is in fact domain knowledge. What really matters here is that you have to understand that that bias, that domain knowledge, sneaks in everywhere along the development pipeline. It exists not just in the data, but exists in the way that you describe the problem. It exists in the hyperparameters that you choose. It exists in the objectives that you choose. If your goal is to predict, to have perfect accuracy, that's actually a different problem. You don't think it is, but it's a different problem from trying to manage both accuracy and accuracy across all classes. Right? Those are two completely different things, and one of those is harder to do than the other. But particularly when you have minority classes or classes you don't bother to think about, it turns out that you don't even see that you get those kinds of errors. And those are real fundamental trade-offs, and those trade-offs are all throughout the pipeline. And by the way, when I say they're all throughout the pipeline, I just don't mean at the machine learning case or getting the right set of people in a room. They begin before you even start thinking about what you are doing, what it is you are trying to solve. So, for example, one of the reasons why taking bunches of pictures of Senegalese doesn't necessarily doesn't necessarily lead to the outcome you want is because it turns out cameras aren't optimized for that. You actually have a different distribution of luminance. You have a different distribution of color, and it just turns out that cameras do things slightly different under slightly different situations around contrast, and that is either easier or harder for your deep learning algorithm to latch onto. And so the problem begins with the camera, the problem begins with the physics, the problem begins with the way you define the problem. And once you decide you're going to bring human beings into the mix, and that you're going to build systems that are going to be used by human beings, used with human beings, and used on human beings, then you have to start thinking very, very, very carefully about the entire software engineering pipeline. So that brings me near the end. I'm just going to do a very quick plug for a talk that goes into excruciating detail about all of the different ways that you can run into these sorts of problems and all the different ways that you can sort of attack and solve these problems. This talk is available. You can see it at the link below. I will try to entice you to do this because it was a talk I had to give, but I sat around for 2 months and made a movie. So there's actually a movie about it with interviews with like 14 or 15 experts, and it's even better than the Thriller video, and involves my good friend Michael Littman. And you can go out there and learn a lot about sort of the promise as well as the problems of doing this. So let me recommend that. Anyway, there's a lot that I said here, I know, and it sort of bounced all over the place, but I think we're kind of at a stage of AI machine learning where you have to bounce all over the place to really get a kind of view of the whole picture. And so with that, I am more than happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Charles. This was fascinating. And in fact, while in bouncing from one place to another, you did leave very, very important kind of messages. And we'll follow up with a couple of questions. Let me first ask you if you can actually just say a few more words about this very important concept of these better than the sum of its parts. I mean, it's something that at JPMorgan, for example, we debate whether AI is going to take your job or whether your job is something that AI will never be able to do it. So how do you think that we should approach this better than its parts in practice? In practice, do we have the AI do only part of the job? So you think about someone who has a current task and needs to automate part of it, or it's done manually. So can you say a little bit more about the process or advice or thoughts on this process of reaching the goal of having the human and AI being better than the sum of its parts?
Yeah, so that's actually a great way to sort of to couch the question, right? So let's take the direct economic question. So it is absolutely the case that there are some jobs that get automated away. This has been true since the dawn of time, right? At some point, you've got tractors, right? At some point, you've got machines that can saw faster than you can, and so on. So this will go away. And by the way, the correct way to think about it is exactly to use exactly the word that you use. It's automation, right? Machines can count to 1 million without getting tired, and they will do things that people will never do, even if humans want to do it, because they can do it tirelessly. They don't have anything in the way. So yes, there are things that will go away, including the job that you're completely convinced can't possibly go away, and it will go away in subtle ways. So, for example, you mentioned the MOOC-based master's program we have. Here's a number for you that you'll find interesting. We started with 0 6 years ago. We now have 11,000 students in that program. At the current state, by the way, 93% of them are people who would have never pursued a master's degree if this program weren't available. By the way, it costs $7,000 for the entire degree from a top 10 ranked program. And we accept 80% of the people who apply because scale works. Why am I bringing this up? Because I am now able, at the current state, we expect 1 out of 6 of every master's student in the United States to be from Georgia Tech going forward, if this maintains. That's a bragging point, but actually, if I can now teach, and I still teach even as a dean, I teach 3,000 students a year. Before, that would have taken 15 of me. Now it only takes 1. So in theory, I've taken a job away from someone. But the other side of that is just as important, which is there was 3,000 people who weren't going to get taught before because there weren't 15 of me. So the positive of this is by working the automation side of it, whether it's AI or it's just a faster machine, by bringing it together with the human being, you actually get more done. The pie actually grows, not necessarily in my job, but in the generation of people with sets of knowledge, experiences and skills they wouldn't have had otherwise. So as a practical matter, yes, it will change your job, but again, even the non-expert human makes the expert chess player, chess machine better. So the job will change, but the job will change in the same way that the job changes when whatever it is you're working on, you now have a team of people you work with. The nature of your job changes and it scales like that because now you're dealing with other people. But in theory, everything gets better overall. So my belief is, and history so far bears this out, is that the job, it's not that the jobs go away, it's that the jobs change and that you suddenly make possible things that were not obviously possible before. And therefore you get to do things that you weren't able to do before. And so the jobs get bigger and more interesting as opposed to going away.
Excellent. I'll keep asking questions, but please raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and I'll be happy to say your question. I know that Tucker Balch, who is a research director in my AI research group, is also present, and Tucker Balch has been a faculty at Georgia Tech and working closely with Charles Isbell. So Tucker, feel free to ask a question also. And in the meantime, I also want to ask another question that I think it's fundamental for us also to understand, which is your concept, very beautiful within the history, or I mean, this interaction, this not just the goal, but the way. So this concept of being not optimizing necessarily, but capturing the way. So we can think about these in terms of interactions with clients, with terms of interactions of like sequence of things that we do towards a goal. And so from the point of view of the having that as a principle, besides the mathematical aspects of trajectories in terms of reinforcement learning or all sorts of other mathematical tools, what type of like approach should we follow to emphasize also the way and not just the goal in other method? I mean, can you add some thoughts about these? Because I think this is an important, also outcome of your talk.
Right. So that's exactly right. I mean, the kind of transactional way to think about it for people who don't already buy this is you talk about a goal, but it's not a goal. You know as well as, I mean, every single person who's ever sold anything to anyone here knows this. Every time you try to deal with a product, the way in which you do it is just as important to achieving the goal as achieving the goal, right? You can't get the person to say yes if you walk up and punch them in the face first, right? I mean, most of the time. And so the way in which you do it really matters. So you have to believe that because that's how you operate in the real world. The second thing is you have to recognize that there are ways of doing it better than others. You know what some of those are, you can articulate some of them, but given that you know this, it's important to use the machines, it's important to codify, it's important to understand and to adapt how you're going to do that. And then once you realize that, you start to understand, oh, but it's not just that there's a single way. There are multiple ways, and that's going to depend upon the person you're dealing with. So I didn't talk about this, but one of the neat results of some of this work is the realization that there are different kinds of people. In games, there's like 3 or 4. They're the people who seek chaos. They're the people who just want to get there as efficiently as possible. They're the people who want to do it with style. Like you only get 2 points for getting the ball in the basket in basketball, but people prefer those who dunk to people who do a layup, right? I mean, there are ways in which these kinds of things matter, and you have to determine which person you're dealing with. And the good news, at least from our work, is that you can usually figure that out very early. Like it's the first or second thing you do determines everything else, and you can kind of go from there. By the way, I will tell you that humans are remarkably predictable. I have learned doing this kind of work, and I've also learned that people hate it when you tell them they're remarkably predictable. So you have to be very careful with the way that you interact with them. But that notion of multiple steps and there are different ways of doing it and it works differently for different people, it's just true. We know this. And so you need to build systems that can react and help you to do that more quickly. And,
very nice.
Tucker's here. I got a question.
Tucker.
Hey, Charles, you look wonderful in blonde hair. I don't know why you don't just go with that look. I think you should stick with it. But anyhow, So just so everyone knows, I also am a teacher in this online master's degree. I'm not teaching now, but as Charles mentioned, he can teach 3,000 students a year. I'm teaching 1,000 students a year, and I'm not even there. So it's like the ghost of Tucker is teaching. So I think that's a wonderful accelerator. But here's my question for you. Teaching is a lot like a narrative, right? And I wonder if you've thought much about how can we use some of these techniques you're thinking about to improve online teaching. And I think the answer is almost certainly yes, but it seems like it would be really time consuming to construct such a class, but maybe it's worth it. Anyways, let you think about that.
Okay, so I actually have an answer to that. And by the way, I think that, if you want to be very sort of practical about what y'all do every day, I think it's the same thing, right? No matter what you're doing, you're telling a story, right? Because anything that is a sequence of events is a narrative or a story. So if you think about it in teaching, which is something everyone either understands or think they understand, I mean, we've all learned if we haven't all taught. There are different ways that you go through. So here's a really simple example. I had a bunch of people were arguing about the best way to study for my class, and half the people were arguing, read the book and then listen to the lectures. And the other half were going, no, listen to the lectures, then read the book. What was actually happening is, it was sort of blew my mind that no one ever sees this, is what you're really saying is you have to see it more than once to understand the concept, right? It doesn't matter, whichever one you do second is the one you think is better because that's when it clicked for you, right? But the order doesn't really matter. I mean, maybe for some people it does, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is the repetition. And so in teaching, it's actually very straightforward, right? You have an insane amount of data. I've clicked on this thing, I've watched this lecture, I've taken this quiz, I've done whatever. There's tons of it, so much of it we don't even know what to do with. But it's there enough that you could, even with very simple techniques, improve by giving feedback to students very quickly about whether they're walking down a good path or not. And it actually wouldn't be as hard as building a whole video game. To just make small changes that will have huge impact. And that's also true for everything else you do when you interact with customers, when you are learning yourself. They're all sort of this form. And so I think the idea of just realizing it's the narrative and its multiple steps, and then building systems that take advantage of that gets you a win right away. And then, it'll take you years to figure out the best way of doing it and all that, but you can get a big win right away just by recognizing that you've been using, that this is the right data structure.
Very good. So I apologize, we don't have time for more questions, but I do think that we will keep in touch with you, Charles. For a lot of the things we do are about humans and AI, and I would love to have the opportunity to continue this conversation occasionally and have people, I welcome people to send email to Professor Isbell, and he will leave it up to answer as much as he can.
Absolutely.
And thank you very much, Charles, for your time. Thank you very much for your lecture. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much.
See you next time. Thank you, Charles. Thank you very much. Thank you. Excellent.
Bye, everyone.